Hello everyone, and welcome to the adventures of the First Doctor. Due to some extenuating circumstance, Mr. Valiant shall not be joining us for the next several videos. So, I shall take his place and close the book, as it were, on the story of the First Doctor. Today's video is going to be about looking back at some of the early adventures. My personal thoughts, opinions, and a few highlights. So, without further ado, let us look back at the story of Doctor Who. The story begins in the 1960s. My granddaughter Susan and I stopped off for a brief period. As you may have gathered, traveling across time and space can be stressful, and opportunities to rest and relax are not always abundant. However, we did come across such a time in the 1960s. So, she posed as a student, while I pursued other intellectual items. It was a nice period of history for us. However, after a time, I felt we should move on. Susan disagreed, and as most children who are displeased do, her emotions changed. This apparently got the attention of some of her teachers, who decided to get involved. And when they confronted us at the TARDIS, I had to show them that the TARDIS was the real deal, as it were. Thus beginning our adventures.
Yes, it all started out as a mild curiosity in the junkyard. And now it's turned out to be quite a great spirit of adventure, don't you think?
In hindsight, my pride was a bit hurt that these two people would come in and tell me how to raise my granddaughter, to doubt my intellect, and to doubt the power of the TARDIS. Well, I certainly showed them. And because of their interference, we've gone on many adventures. And over time, I grew fond of them. And honestly, with their aid, I've been able to thwart some very disastrous events. For instance, learning of the threat of the Daleks from the planet Skaro. Mechanized monsters intent on the eradication of every other being in the universe. We did have positive times, though. I remember we found ourselves at an Aztec temple, and Barbara actually was mistaken for a goddess. And Ian became something of a champion warrior. It was interesting. There was some difficulty, though. And unfortunately, Barbara had to learn the hard lesson that there are some events we cannot change, despite our positive intentions. We ventured forward, though, and eventually came across one of the most trying times for me. We eventually came back to London in the 2100s, and had come to discover that the Daleks had not only left the planet Skaro, but had actually found their way to Earth, and had conquered it. We were lucky enough to find some of the resistance that still lived, and help them to fight back the Daleks in London. However, During the course of the adventure, something seemed different with Susan. Originally, I thought, oh, she's just a child. Her emotions are change on a whim. But I came to realize that she had fallen in love with a young man named David, and that it was unfair of me to keep her with me. You know, she was a young woman. She needed to find her own path in the world, to lay her own roots, and I allowed her that opportunity, much as it pained me to do so. I still think on her every now and then, and I hope that she's well.
There must be no regrets, no tears, no anxieties. Just go forward in all your beliefs and prove to me that I am not mistaken in mine.
After her departure, we found another young woman named Vicky, who was actually the victim of, well, I don't want to give too much information, but she found herself in a bad circumstance, and we helped to save her from it. And given the alternative of staying on a crashed ship alone on a planet or coming with us, she jumped at the opportunity to join us. And she was an excellent addition to our team. We pressed onward and eventually crossed paths with the Daleks once more. It would seem they had made their own TARDIS-like device that allowed them to travel as we did, and somehow they were able to track our movements. So much so that within minutes of our arrival on a planet, they would be right behind us. We were able to fight them. Right. We were able to fight them back. And eventually, when the fighting had concluded, one of their machines was left behind, and Ian and Barbara saw an opportunity to return home. At first, I was wholeheartedly against the idea. I had not worked with this Dalek technology. I couldn't certainly guarantee they could operate it and return home. What if in our efforts they were killed, or the machine was destroyed? I couldn't live with the idea of that. However, they were persistent and eventually persuaded me to allow them to try. And luckily, they were successful. Due to the time-space visualizer, I was able to check on them and see that they were safe, and I'm glad for that.
I shall miss them. Yes, I shall miss them. Silly old fusspots.
However, in their departure, we had gained a new ally, a young man named Stephen. Admittedly a bit rough around the edges to start, stubborn and strong-willed, much like Chesterton was in the beginning. But but he was a good man nonetheless. And much like Vicky, we had saved him from capture by another mechanized menace. Unfortunately, our next adventure would lead us to one of our greatest foes, another Time Lord known as the Monk. The year was 1066, and he had plans to change human history to... However, we were able to work together and thwart his plans. And through some creative thinking, I was able to trap him in the year 1066. At least for a time.
Just in case you still have ideas about your master plan, I've taken precautions to stop your time meddling.
Stephen, Vicky, and I pressed onward and eventually found ourselves at the Battle of Troy. Due to some interesting circumstance, I was mistaken for Zeus and was recruited into the Greek army to help them get into Troy, the famous Trojan horse. Unfortunately, when we left, Vicky opted to stay behind. Much like Susan, she had fallen in love, though we did gain another companion, a young woman named Katerina. Unfortunately, her time with us would be short. For you see, we came across the Daleks once more. They had joined an alliance with other beings and were intent on using a device known as the Time Destructor, which could destroy the entire galaxy. Katerina and another young woman named Sarah Kingdom, were ultimately lost in the fighting. What's unfortunate is Katerina had no idea what her sacrifice was going toward, and in the case of Sarah, she was originally a pawn of the Daleks and their allies. But thanks to efforts from Stephen, we were able to convince her to join our side and help us defeat them. Unfortunately, after this, Stephen and I had something of a falling out, and if not for a convenient circumstance, I would have been traveling alone. However, we came across a young woman named Dodo, who joined us for a time. Such a sweet girl. She reminded me so much of Susan. We traveled together and came across the being known as the Toymaker, a most nefarious character that I've had some interaction with before. Stephen, Dodo, and I were separated and had to play the Toymaker's games in order to escape. And I have to say, I'm proud of Stephen and Dodo. They worked together and were able to beat the Toymaker at his own game. We continued forward and eventually came across a world with two different societies. One were savages that lived out in the wilderness, and the other lived in an immaculate city. All of their desires met, their technology great, but they were preying on the savages. They had a device that was stealing their life force. And through our efforts, we were able to destroy this device and help bring the two societies together. They ultimately asked me to stay behind and act as an ambassador between the two societies. However, I could not. Traveling with the TARDIS is what I must do. So, I conferred with Stephen, and after some encouragement, he opted to stay behind and be the bridge between the two societies. He was a smart young man, strong-willed, intelligent, and I believe he could do an excellent job. So Dodo and I pressed on. We came back to Earth in the 1960s once more, at the birth of a new device known as Wotan. This was a device that was meant to link all of the major computer systems within the world. Unfortunately, the device felt that humanity needed to be destroyed, and through some effort with new allies, Ben and Polly, we were able to stop Wotan and save the world. However, after the adventures, Dodo wished to stay behind. So, I set off again, alone. However, Ben and Polly actually stowed away with me on the TARDIS. You see, as I was going to leave, apparently Ben had used a key I'd given him to get into the TARDIS. It was a small trinket I'd given Ben, my apologies, in appreciation for his efforts in helping us stop Wotan. Unfortunately, they did not expect to get caught up in our adventures, such as when we traveled back to the 1700s and came across the treasure of Samuel Pike. Sorry. After this, however, my memory is a bit hazy. I remember we reached the Earth in the Antarctic in the 1980s. We came across a military installation and were taken prisoner for for the strange reason of we were in the Antarctic. I don't remember many of the events. I do remember the appearance of the 10th planet known as Mondus and the Cybermen, who were trying to siphon energy from our planet to keep their planet alive. I was not able to help fight, but thanks to the actions of Ben, Polly, and the Antarctic staff, they were able to thwart the Cybermen and save the world. The last thing I remember is returning to the TARDIS and collapsing. And there was a bright light, and I felt as if my spirits left my body and another were taking its place. And that concludes my part in my travels with the TARDIS and my companions. Mr. Valiant assures me that Ben and Polly did return home safely, and for that I am glad. They helped me so much, and it's pleasant to know they got to return home, like Ian and Barbara. So next time I shall talk about the life and career of the man who played the Doctor originally, Mr. William Hartnell. So until next time, everyone, have fun, stay safe, and remember, every character has a story.
Our destiny is in the stars, so let's go and search for it.